Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is John McKeever from Data Migrators, based in Melbourne, Australia, and I'm joined by Drew Nuttall-Smith, one of our senior devs. And today we're going to do a bit of CI/CD with DataStage NextGen on Cloudpak. So we've got a DataStage 5.3 install,
Yes.
uh, self-hosted on AWS. But everything you see will also work for DataStage SaaS, hosted on IBM Cloud. And it will work regardless of whether you're running your own engines, your own DataStage data processing engines, or whether you're using DataStage anywhere. So this is a good broad spectrum example of how you do CI/CD with DataStage NextGen. We're going to be using a command line tool to perform the data stage export and push into Git. We're not going to be using the current Git interface available for data stage software, data stage next gen software, the self-hosted version. That's undergoing some change at the moment. I gather that future versions may see some updates to that. In its current guise, there are a couple of challenges which I think are widely acknowledged, and also DataStage SaaS does not have a Git interface. So what we're providing is a ubiquitous solution you can use anywhere, same approach.
And
Uh,
worth noting just at this point that such when the time comes that the Git integration is ready, built into CP4D, our solution we're going to show today is designed so you can just switch over, no interruptions, everything that you've got in your Git repository will just carry on as is.
Absolutely. Very good point. And on that topic, Drew, do you want to walk us through taking assets from NextGen into CI/CD? Oh, and I should point out, we're going to be using a GitHub repository for our Git storage, and we're going to be consequently using a GitHub Actions pipeline to perform our CI/CD checks and deploy downstream. If you uh, haven't seen other data migrators CI/CD demos with classic data stage 11.7, then what we're effectively going to be doing is pushing into Git, triggering a CI/CD pipeline, automatically running static and dynamic code analysis, and then if our tests pass, then taking that build and automatically pushing it downstream into one or more higher order test environments. Over to you, Drew.
Yes. And so what we're going to demonstrate today uses effectively a command line tool called MCIX, and that provides a number of plugins that allow you to perform the actions you're going to need as part of your CI/CD process. And as John said, today we'll be demonstrating this with GitHub. So here is the GitHub repository that we'll be using, but the tools are completely agnostic of your CI/CD tooling. So if you're using Azure or you're using Jenkins or whatever, it all works the same.
And this
So
repository, sorry, and this
yeah,
repository, we provide an example template for you, and I'll be showing you at the end of the video the links where you can go and have a look at those examples.
yes, yes, absolutely. So we're going to start high level, get some things running so you can see, make it concrete, and then a little bit later we'll take a step back and show you how we got here.
Yeah.
So here's our Git repository, a number of folders. You don't need to know too much in detail about what each of them is, but notably right now we don't have any data stage assets in here yet. So imagine this is a fresh repository. We're just getting set up with CI/CD on our next-gen data stage project. Here is our dev project, which has a number of assets of various types loaded in. And the first thing we're going to do is get these assets into our Git repository. So, as John said, we're not going to use the built-in Git integration tools in CP4D right now. So I'm going to go over to my local install of the MCIX tools that we mentioned before and export those assets from this project into my local Git clone and then commit and push those assets into the GitHub repository. So here I've got my local install of MCIX and I'm going to run an export command. So first thing you can do is, if I ls that, you'll see there's a contents directory, and if I ls that, you'll see there's a number of things inside of there. but notably where the command that you need to run actually is inside contents, and then Mac OS. For me, it's Mac OS, and then MCIX. So if I just run the help command, this will list what we call namespaces that I have from the plugins that I've got installed in my instance of MCIX. And the DataStage namespace contains your export and import commands. So if I run MCIX DataStage help, you're now going to see, I was meant to type help DataStage anyway, but you'll see the commands available to me are compile, import, and export. So the only one I'm going to run manually today outside of a CI/CD pipeline is the export command. So again, if I run MCIX help DataStage export, now this shows me the list of command line arguments that I need to provide to the command. So there are some that are required, there are some that are optional, and there are some that you must provide at least one of a couple of options. So in this example, we're going to point it to that dev project that we just saw by giving the URL of the CP4D instance, a username, and API key. Then we're going to give the project. You can give the name or the ID of that project. And we're going to provide an export path, the location where we want to export all of those assets to. And where I'm going to point this to is here. I have a local clone of that Git repository we saw. So if I ls that, you can see the same directories and files that we saw in GitHub. Now I'm going to create a DataStage directory within here that all of my DataStage assets are going to live under. So that's where I'm going to provide as the location for this export path parameter. So if I just run here's a command I prepared earlier that has all of those arguments I described filled out. So the URL for my CP4D instance, this is my dev project name, sorry, get rid of that, user, API key, and then the export path. So here's the path to that local git clone we just saw, and then the DataStage directory under that. So I'm going to run that, and then we'll see what it does as it goes along. You can see we're exporting project containing 98 assets. That'll think for a little while, and then we'll get status on each of those actions. Okay, you can see that looks like that was very successful. We've written all of those assets to disk. Now if I go over to my Git repository and run ls again, we've got a DataStage directory now. And you can see a number of directories under that for each of the asset types. So if I run git status at this point, you can see that is new. So what we're going to do just for this initial commit is just add that entire directory. Now worth noting at this point, I'm using the command line git tools. You can use whichever local git client you prefer. Yes, John? Oh, you're on mute, by the way.
Might want to avoid using your Git shortcuts.
Oh, I did it again. I remembered for the status, but then for the add, I went back into muscle memory. Yes, I will endeavor not to do that. If you ever see me just type G, that means git, and A means add, but don't be alarmed. Yes, so that was the same as me typing this. But yes, you can use source tree or any other git client you use, or the command line if you're crazy like me. As you can see, status, these files have been added. So I just need to commit them, and I'll just give that a message of initial commit. And now git push. Okay, so now we have all of the assets from our development DataStage project in our Git repository. Easy as that. And that's going to automatically have triggered our GitHub Actions pipeline linked to that repository. So we're going to go have a look at that quickly now. Before we do that, I'll just show you quickly as that's running in the background. Here is my CI project. So it's the same name with just CI attached, and you can see right now we don't have any assets in here other than a test data connection, which I've configured under the DataStage project settings to be used to locate our test data when Metal CI unit tests are running. But let's go back to GitHub. If I refresh this, you can see we've got the DataStage directory because of initial commit. But I'm just going to open a new tab at the Actions page, and we can see the pipeline is running here. So this is a high-level overview of what a CI/CD pipeline for DataStage NextGen looks like. So again, we're just going to go over this in the very high level before we then take a step back and show you how we got here. Just showing you this first to make it a little bit more concrete. The first block here that we're running is deploying to CI. So that project that we just showed you that only had the one connection in it should soon have all of the assets that we've just committed. And if I look at the logs here, you can see you can see the commands that are being run. These commands, for example, MCIX overlay, which we'll get into, and MCIX import, things like that. MCIX data stage import there. Those are the same commands like the export command I just showed you me running locally. So that's the same tool, and the only one of these commands that you're going to need to run manually at this stage is the export command that we just saw. All the rest of them are run automatically as part of this pipeline. And you can see the import statements for all of those assets that we've just committed to Git. But anyway, you don't need to get too stuck into the low-level detail in the logs here. Just thought I'd show you that where that detail exists, should you be interested. Oh, I've gone one level too far. You can see that block's completed successfully. And now, if I just quickly navigate back to that project and click refresh, there we go. We can see all those assets are there now. So now we have all the assets from our dev project. They have been deployed into our CI project. And the pipeline is now going to go ahead and run a set of tests that we have defined to validate those changes. The first two blocks here you can see are asset analysis. So these are rules that you choose to define certain parameters about your different assets in your project. And so, for example, you might have a rule that says you can't have any hard-coded database credentials or hard-coded file paths in your project. Or it might be just general design rules like performance things. Maybe you might say you have a maximum number of assets in one flow. All sorts of different stuff. We're not going to get into huge detail about that now, but just know that that's what asset analysis is. And then we run unit tests, which you're probably a bit more familiar with the concept of that. These are functional tests for each of your flows. Now we can see that one of our asset analysis steps passed, our unit tests passed, but the critical asset analysis rules have failed. So we can click in there and look through the logs to see what's happened there, or we can just scroll down to the summary sections for each of those steps. You can see import has passed, compile has passed, but for asset analysis test we have one failure. So if I click to expand the report details, I have a flow called load daily sales summary, and it has failed the rule hard-coded database credentials. So I'm going to go back now to my dev project. Well, before I say that, now you can see we failed tests at the CI stage, so we're not going to go ahead and deploy those changes to further downstream environments. We validated them, we found an issue, now we go back to dev, we'll address the issue and deploy again. So if I go back to my dev project, and here, conveniently, the first flow that we see is the one that failed that rule. So I'm going to open that, and it was hard-coded database credentials was the rule that we failed. So there's only one database connection here. I'm going to open that. And indeed, you can see all of my connections are hard-coded, and we've decided that that's not appropriate for this project. So I can quickly fix that by switching to this connection asset instead. Apply the change, save that. All right, so that's saved. Now I'm going to go back. I want to commit that change into Git. So I go back first to my MCIX, install, and run that export command again. With all the same details, you'll notice at this stage, this command just does a bulk export of the entire project. In the near future, there will be a version of this command that will detect what has changed in your project and only export the changes. But that's just waiting on a later release of CP4D to have the APIs available for that. But we're going to run the bulk export. It's going to export everything. But just like last time, I've pointed this to my local Git clone. So this is going to export over the top of the previous export we did. And then we're going to use Git's diffing tools to tell us what has changed and what has not, which makes our life a little bit easier. The export succeeded. Now I go back to my local Git clone and run git status. And you can see it's told me this is the asset we've changed. We do get one other modification notice here, and that's just because this is a test case due to the nature of the way the zip files are generated. It's non-deterministic in the exact contents of that binary. So that says that's been modified, but it actually hasn't. But the only other asset we can see here listed as modified is the asset we indeed did modify. So that makes your life a bit easier finding out what's changed and committing them easily. So I'll just copy that, add that change, and commit it. And I'm going to give it a message, fixed asset, fixed hard-coded DB credentials, something like that. And push that change. So the previous export and commit that we saw was the initial commit of our entire project. Now this time we're just committing one change into the Git repository where we already have all of our assets. So now that should have triggered our pipeline, or will soon at least. We'll go back here, go back to our list of pipe action runs. Okay, fixed hardcoded DB credentials, that's running now. So now we can watch our pipeline run through, and this time we expect it to get through all of these tests. They should all pass. And then, John, I'm right in saying that we have a manual gate on all of the downstream environments beyond CI. So it won't automatically deploy unless we tick a box to say, yes, we're happy and we want this deployed downstream.
Yeah, so those environments, if you go into in GitHub, you go into your settings, you'll see each of your environments listed, and you can define approval gates against each of those. And that can be a bunch of people who get notified via email or whatever channel you want, and they have to come in, and you can set all kinds of criteria about one of that group of people need to approve them, or all of those people, or it gets quite sophisticated.
Yeah, up to you. So we've got it automatically deploying to CI, which I can't imagine anyone not doing that. And then all subsequent environments are a manual gate. You could have it automatically deploy to QA should it pass tests in CI, and then manual gates after that. That's up to you and your business rules.
You can even write your own apps that will analyze the test results and automatically approve releases or do whatever you need business process wise to support the release downstream.
Yes, yes. And here you might be wondering, why do we have two asset analysis steps, critical and warnings? So critical are ones that asset analysis rules we deem should, if they don't pass, the CI build should fail. And warnings, they might be something that's important, but perhaps it's more of a performance thing, or whatever you deem is something that we should be doing, but isn't important enough to fail the build. Now, you don't need to have that, but there's many options how you can configure the pipeline for your own needs. So again, QA waiting for review. Everything's passed, we fixed that compliance rule, so ready to go. Requested your review to deploy to QA. I'm going to review that, and you can see here there's multiple reviewers, but we just need one person to review this. Deploying to QA. approve and deploy. Okay, so now that is running. So that's the high-level overview of our pipeline. There's one more detail I think it's worth mentioning here before we take a step back, and John will show you how you can get to this state as well, which is I'm going to go over a step that we run during each of these deployment blocks called where we apply what we call overlays. Now, you might have had a question in your mind watching this already, which is we've got our assets that we've taken from dev, we're deploying them to CI, but then we're deploying them to each of these downstream environments. You might be thinking, well, we have differences in our projects that run in each of our environments. Production connects to different databases than dev. As you saw, I was setting some database credentials there before. And we use what we call overlays to allow you to modify the configuration of your project when needed for each of your environments. So while deploy to QA is happening, I'll just go back to my files in GitHub. And one of the top level directories you see is called overlays. So if I navigate there, the top level directory inside of that you see is a name for each of my environments. So I've got CI, performance, prod, QA. And if I go into QA as an example, you can see now we have different asset types under here. So if I keep digging in to parameter set, now you can see I have the name of different assets that I have in my project. JSON files technically. And these, you don't need to pay too much attention to the details of this, but all you need to know is that this is defining different configuration for that parameter set for the QA environment. So you can configure many different asset types in different ways depending on your needs for each of your environments, so that the configuration, we call it all of the assets plus this, is your configuration that you're deploying to an environment. So that's just a little quick glance so you can see where that exists, but we can see deploy to QA succeeded. So I might just show you one of those parameter sets in CI or dev versus QA to show you how that the overlays have applied and that parameter set is subtly different in those two environments. So if I go, let's just go back to dev, and I'll go to configurations, parameter sets, and let's look at PS database connect. And now we can see we've got our parameter set here with some database configurations. Now in a separate tab, I'll have my QA project, and I'll just open that same parameter set. And then we compare and contrast. So if I go to dev, you can see that my database name is called dev_cp for D. Now if I go to that same parameter set in QA, you can see my database name is called QA_cp for D. Now this happened automatically in the pipeline. The step before we import all of your assets, we run the overlays command, and it will apply the overlays defined in the repository to those assets in the repository. So now you have a configuration that's specific to the environment that you're deploying to in that step. So I think that's a good high-level overview for now. I don't know if there's anything else I've forgotten, John, or if that's a good point to stop and step back and see how we got here.
I think that's good enough for now. Obviously, people will have a lot of questions, and
Yes.
are available on IBM Slack, or through, you can just email us inquiries@datamigrators.com, and you'll get through to us, and we'll do what we can. But probably for most IBM customers, through your IBM rep, technical or sales rep is probably the best point of contact for us.
Yeah.
Let's just talk a little bit about how this is architected and what we provide people.
Should I hand over the share?
Why not?
Cool.
So Drew showed you an example of the MCIX command, and here's some prototype documentation that will become live on the IBM website in time for the MCIX command. And you'll see that we've got, they're broken up into namespaces. So you've got MCIX, namespace, then the command, and the namespace are kind of logical groupings of commands. So for DataStage, you can import, export, and compile. So Drew showed you an import command.
Export command.
Sorry? So you showed
Export.
an export command, and then as part of the pipeline, we ran the import command. And here's the syntax of the import command, some brief documentation, and an example of how you might use it at the command line. As Drew showed us the export command at the command line. But we also show you how you can use this command inside a GitHub action. We've also got documentation. Everything you've seen today is also available for Azure DevOps using custom Azure DevOps tasks. But here's an example of how you can access that MCIX functionality natively within your GitHub pipelines. Unlike the old Metal CI command for DataStage 11.7, if any of your customers coming from the 11.7 landscape, you may well be familiar with the idea of having to stand up a host, and on that host you had to have a DataStage client tier and a Metal CI command, and that was necessary for technical reasons. You'd also have to have your CI/CD runner installed on there as well. So if you're using GitHub or Azure or Jenkins, you'd have to have a native remote runner installed on this host that you'd have to provision yourself. And so the infrastructure requirements were not insignificant, and there was definitely a bar you had to jump over. And that was necessary because of the architecture of DataStage 11.7. For DataStage NextGen, all of those requirements are gone. You don't need to worry about a runner. You don't need to worry about provisioning hardware. You don't need to do installation of any software. You can literally write a GitHub action and take this text, drop it in there, and it will run MCIX natively on the GitHub SaaS platform. Microsoft will provision the infrastructure for you, and it runs using a container. So I'm just going to quickly show you some architecture here, and I'm not going to get too detailed, but the MCIX command, along with the plugins that Drew mentioned, which are actually the jar files underneath, it's written in Java, that provide the functionality, they're actually available in an MCIX container, which we publish. We publish it in various registries. It's about to be published on the IBM container registry, and that will be the official container image that will be used by all of these SaaS CI/CD platforms. And then we make that container image available as native GitHub Actions on the GitHub environment, and also native Azure DevOps tasks on the Azure environment. And so the CI/CD pipeline that you saw executing today makes references to those GitHub actions, which behind the scenes automatically provision an instance of the MCIX container, pulls it from the IBM registry, instantiates it, and runs the MCIX functionality for you. Okay. These GitHub actions are available in the GitHub Marketplace. So if you go to GitHub Marketplace and type DataStage, for example, you will just bring this down. You'll see you get a whole bunch of MCIX actions available to you. So for example, we saw MCIX DataStage import happening. So if I just click on that one, this takes you to the repository that contains the reference, the GitHub repository, public, that contains the documentation for the MCIX DataStage import action. Again, an example of how to use it, which inputs are mandatory, a description of the inputs and the outputs, and some practical usage in context.
So, John, did you say that I don't need to download anything or install this? If I just copy that usage example into my pipeline, it will just run?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So here's the run that Drew ran, and you can see it's currently waiting, looking for authorization to deploy the build that was successfully deployed to QA. It's now ready to deploy that same build down to performance. Obviously, as part of the deploy, it will perform the overlay process necessary. So let's just have a quick look at the actual process, the CI/CD process behind this. So your CI/CD pipeline is itself stored as code. So if I go into .github/workflows in the roots of our repository, we can see we have this Metal CI NextGen DevOps YAML file. Just jump in there. And we have documented this extensively. So there's lots of comments that talk about all of the variables and secrets that this example pipeline is reliant upon. This is an example pipeline. This is not the pipeline you must run. This is not prescriptive at all. This is some code. We provide the code like this to you. The idea is you take it, you adapt it, you adopt it, you add new bits to it, throw out bits that aren't relevant to you, configure it to exactly what you need. This is just an example of a generic CI/CD pipeline that a DataStage NextGen customer might want to use on GitHub. But it does a good job of illustrating all of the main points like overlays, automated deployment, execution of static and dynamic code analysis. So we've got some setup at the top. I'm not going to use this as an opportunity to teach GitHub CI/CD pipeline authoring. It's all well documented by Microsoft, but I just want to draw your attention to a couple of items. The first item you may have seen, so I'm just going to bring up another tab just to go back to the summary. You may have noticed this little diagnostics step here, and that ran this first thing here at the top, which is MCIX system version. That simply provides some diagnostic information out of the container to say, hey, what version of the MCIX command are we using? What version of the container are we using? Has the container undergone security vetting? Where are the security assets that prove that security vetting? What plugins are installed in that container and what versions are those plugins, and just give me a bit of a system log to tell me that everything's being invoked and executed correctly. And this is kind of useful information that if you were to ever raise a support call with us to kind of query some results you were getting that you weren't understanding, or you'd upgraded your version of CPD and wanted to make sure that you were using a version of the container that aligned with that, then we would come to this, we'd say, run the system, MCIX system version and give us those results so we can align it. And it just takes a few seconds to run. So it's kind of maybe good practice to stick that at the start of a pipeline anyway. Then further down, and you can see here's the example that you actually need to stick into your pipeline to run that. Very, very simple. So down here, now, one of the things we did was we ran a deploy step. So if we just jump into deploy and have a look at what we did, what you might normally think of in deploy is, if I just go back to the MCIX commands, you might think, well, I'll run overlay to convert my assets from, say, the CI environment to adapt them necessary to the specifics of the QA environment. So I'll run overlay, then I'll run import to get those inputs into my CPD environment. Then I'll run compile, which effectively is kind of like the first test. Do my assets compile in this new environment? So I've got those 3 steps. And every time you run a deploy, you're always going to run those 3 steps in order. So what we've actually done is we've wrapped those 3 steps up into a single GitHub action, which we called MCIX composite deploy. So here you can see we've got this one step will actually perform the import and the compile, and we've also got the overlay properties here as well. So it'll do those 3 steps in order: overlay, import, compile in one step. So you haven't got to kind of repeatedly pull the container, run a step, pull the container, run a step. That all happens for you.
Can I ask a quick question now, John?
Absolutely, yeah.
My ears pricked up earlier. We established that we don't have to download this tool. We just put the little snippet into our YAML and it runs. But then you also mentioned that there are security checks for each version of it. How do I determine which version I'm running? Does it automatically run the latest?
So, very good point. Thank you very much. So, here, now this is a dev version and an example version of the pipeline. You'll see that this is where I reference the container uses. So I'm saying go off and in my GitHub repository, in this case, GitHub registry, container registry, run the container found at metal CI, MCIX, and then run the command composite deploy and use the version latest. A customer will never ever use at latest, or should never ever use at latest on a production CI/CD pipeline, because using latest means as soon as we release a new version of the container, you will automatically, your CI/CD pipelines will automatically start using it. What you should do is you should look at our release schedule and say, okay, I'm using this version of CPD. I'm happy with version 2 of the MCIX container. So here I'm going to be saying at V2. Okay. Then at some point we'll release V3, say, for reasons. And then at some point you will then go off, review the release notes for V3, look at its compatibility against the version of CPD that you're using, DataStage NextGen, perform some tests, and then when you're happy, update your CI/CD pipelines to V3. You may also ask the question, can I stick a parameter value there and just stick my container version at the top of the pipeline? No, you can't. GitHub doesn't support that. There you go.
That's not what I thought you were going to say.
Wish it did, it would have been nice, but
What you
no.
would say. You might imagine you could do this, and yes, you can. No.
No, it's normally the thing, isn't it? But unfortunately, that's one of the things. Not it is currently a request with GitHub. Who knows? Maybe by the time people are using this in anger, maybe that's supported. Same thing down here. We've got we're checking out our project repo, checking out our analysis repo, and there using the MCIX asset analysis test command. I'm running static analysis, and here you'll see ignore test failures, false. So that means any test failures for these tests will stop the pipeline dead. So of course, this is our critical failures. Down here, I've got exactly the same thing with the parameter ignore test failures. True, any failures, that's fine. Carry on with the pipeline. So this is just our warnings tests. And the
And
distinction between the two is that here we are using different tags. So here I'm saying exclude the compliance rules that are tagged as fatal rules.
one thing you've just reminded me. I forgot to mention the asset analysis rules that are run in the pipeline. They're found in a Git repository.
In
So
a Git repository.
in our
Yes.
example, we've put them in a separate repository to the one that includes our data stage assets and overlays and pipeline. But there is a Git repository there that this is pointing to, and we will provide a bunch of example rules publicly that you can then draw from and either use verbatim or modify to your own uses and put in your own Git repositories to use in your pipelines.
And it's important to point out that the architecture of this component is actually an interim step, because rules will ultimately be stored and managed in CAMS in CPD itself, and you'll be able to edit rules or aspects of static analysis rules, flow analysis rules in CPD itself.
They will be assets like any other.
There will be assets, but that's down the line. This is a perfectly workable interim solution. And as you mentioned earlier, like everything, there's a very clear roadmap to move from storing rules in a repository to actually storing them in CAMS. By investing in one approach, you're not making life, in fact, you're making life easier for yourself down the line.
Yeah.
So I think we've gone enough into this. I mentioned the
Yeah.
MCIX repository. It's an open source repository, so all the code for these commands is available. You'll see we've got the releases published. Again, this is a pre-production version of the repository, so you won't see 46 tags and that many releases in the version that you see. Packages are the containers. So here we've got the container. We're on version 10561 because we've been doing a lot of iterative development, but you can click on there and that takes you into a description of the container. So by pulling latest, that's the version of the container that you will bring down. And if you want to extract some of those governance artifacts like the security scans, you can just do a Docker run and pull them back just to give yourself confidence that your code is being managed by a well-governed artifact. I think I'm good, unless you think there's anything else we need to cover, Drew.
Um, I think we've covered everything actually. Yeah. Um, yeah, that's
Great.
everything in my notes.
Well, we'll leave it there.
Yeah, there will definitely be questions, of course. There's a lot in there, and perhaps we might even have more subsequent videos following this on each individual section, should there be the demand for it.
Yeah.
But there's always the
Big,
documentation.
yeah, exactly. The big next highlight video will be pretty much this video, but for Azure DevOps, just so we can
Yeah,
cover for those customers as well. But
yeah. We
and
didn't
we'll
touch on unit testing at all, but it's there. You saw it ran. This
yeah,
video isn't to
yeah,
explain the detail of each individual thing. This is just a high level overview.
yeah. We didn't jump into the CI to see that the unit test had been run in the CI/CD
Yeah,
environment as part of the CI/CD. But uh, you can take it as read. That stuff, even though it's all DataStage NextGen and the interface looks different, it's the same process as you would have seen for 11.7. Um, I think that's everything. Wherever we publish this video, it will go to multiple places. We'll probably stick it on YouTube, probably stick it on the IBM internal Slack channels. Wherever you consume this video, we'll associate with it some links to documentation and how you can contact us with more questions. Um, Thanks everyone for your time. Thanks, Drew, for your time and expertise. And
thank you.
see everyone in the next video.
Cool.
Cheers.